Vikings. The name itself conjures images of thunder and steel, dragon-headed longships slicing through icy seas, axe-wielding giants with braided beards, roaring as they storm a misty shore. We know the legends. We've seen the horned helmets in cartoons, even though they never actually wore them. But the stories we tell ourselves are clean. They are simple. They are myths, polished by time. The truth is far messier. It's more ingenious, more brutal, and more profoundly disturbing than any legend. Now we pull back the curtain of myth. We look past the glorious battles and into the shadows of the Longhouse. We will uncover a world built on equal parts brilliance and barbarism. A world of strange science, chilling rituals, and desperate survival. From starting fires with a foul-smelling secret to sacrificing human life for the honour of the dead, the real Viking world was a place of stark and unsettling contradictions. Fact 1. The alchemists of fire and filth. Our journey begins not with the clang of a sword, but with a smell. An acrid, deeply unpleasant odour. Picture this. A Scandinavian wilderness locked in the grip of a damp, bone-chilling cold. The sky is a sheet of iron. Your fingers are numb. Your breath a cloud of white. You are days from the nearest settlement, and you need a fire. Not for comfort, but for life itself. But every piece of wood is saturated with moisture, and your flint and steel produce only feeble, fleeting sparks. What do? In this moment of desperation, you reach into a leather pouch. You pull out not dry tinder, but a flat, leathery strip of fungus. It's sour-smelling, strangely damp, and has been meticulously infused with human urine. Yes, this was the Viking Zippo lighter, and it reveals a side of them we rarely consider, the resourceful and frankly rather disgusting scientist. This wasn't some crude last-ditch effort. It was a calculated scientific process. The fungus, known as touchwood, or Fomes fomentarius, grows like a woody blister on the bark of birch trees. The Vikings would harvest it, not for food, but for its remarkable properties. They would slice it, pound it flat to break down its fibres, and then submerge it for days in stale, collected human urine. Why this foul concoction? Because stale urine is a natural source of sodium nitrate, the very same chemical compound found in gunpowder, a substance that dramatically lowers the ignition temperature and promotes slow, steady combustion. Once the fungus was soaked and dried, it became a portable ember, a smouldering, slow-burning fuel source that could be carried for days, impervious to rain or snow. A Viking on the move didn't need a roaring flame. They just needed a persistent, glowing heart of fire. A tiny spark from flint and steel could bring the treated fungus to life. It wouldn't burst into flame, but it would smoulder with an intense, internal heat. Wrapped in moss and tucked away, this ember could be kept alive for miles, ready to be coaxed back into a full fire with dry grass and kindling at a moment's notice. Imagine the sheer practicality. A warrior on a raid, a hunter tracking prey, a trader crossing a frozen landscape. They carried the power of fire in their pocket, a power born from decay and waste. This wasn't just about brute strength, it was about outsmarting the elements. It was alchemy of the wild. So while we picture them as loud, mead-swilling berserkers, the reality was often quieter and far more clever. They were survivors who understood the chemistry of their environment. This smelly little piece of fungus is a perfect symbol of their world. Harsh, ingenious, a little stomach-turning, but undeniably brilliant. Fact 2. The nightmare with wings. From the quiet genius of survival, we descend into the calculated architecture of pain. They say that in the Viking world, the ultimate expression of vengeance had a shape. It had wings, not of a bird, but of bone and blood. It was called the blood eagle. This is perhaps the most infamous and terrifying execution ritual in all of recorded history. It is so gruesome, so anatomically nightmarish, that for decades, historians debated whether it was even real. Was it a literal practice, or was it merely the dark poetry of the sagas, a literary invention meant to demonize the Vikings? The sagas, however, insist it was real, and if even a fraction of their accounts are true, the blood eagle stands as one of the most horrifying acts ever conceived by human hands. The ritual was reserved for the most hated of enemies, a rival king, a betrayer of oaths, a man who had committed an unforgivable offence. The victim would be dragged to a sacred place, forced face down and held immobile. There was no blindfold, no quick end. only the cold, unflinching eyes of the warriors who had gathered to watch. The executioner would begin with a sharp blade, making a deep incision down the victim's back, tracing the line of the spine. Then, with terrifying precision, the ribs would be severed from the vertebrae, one by one. They were then wrenched outwards, cracked and pulled back to create a grotesque parody of wings. But the horror was not yet complete. The final act involved pulling the victim's lungs out through the openings in their back. If the person was somehow still alive, their final, agonizing breaths would cause the lungs to flutter, draped over the splayed ribs, completing the illusion of bloody, breathing wings. This was not merely an execution, it was a theological statement, a ritual sacrifice to the god Odin. In Norse culture, death was a message. To receive the blood eagle was to be publicly denied an honourable end. It was a curse carved into your very flesh, a declaration that your soul might be barred from the halls of Valhalla. The most famous alleged victim was King Ella of Northumbria. After he executed the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok by casting him into a pit of vipers, Ragnar's sons sought a vengeance of biblical proportions. They captured Ella, and the sagas claim they performed the blood eagle upon him, singing as they worked. While no archaeological evidence, no skeleton with its ribs peeled back, has ever been found, the power of the blood eagle wasn't just in its practice. Its power was in the story. It was psychological warfare. The mere whisper of its name could unnerve entire kingdoms. Whether it was fact or fiction, the fear it inspired was undeniably real. It was a masterpiece of terror, a story so dreadful that it has haunted our imagination for 1,000 years. Fact 3. The surprisingly clean killers. After the visceral horror of the blood eagle, our next fact seems almost jarringly mundane, but in its own way, it's just as revealing. If you picture a Viking, you probably imagine a man caked in the grime of battle and travel, hair matted with mud, beard tangled with the remnants of his last meal. The truth would have shocked you, and it certainly shocked their contemporaries. The Vikings were, by the standards of their time, obsessively clean and well-groomed. Archaeological digs across the Viking world have unearthed a treasure trove of personal grooming tools. These weren't luxury items for the elite. They were everyday essentials found in the graves of men, women, and even children. Combs carved from antler and bone, often intricately decorated. Bronze tweezers, small sharp razors, nail cleaners, and even delicate ear picks. This wasn't just personal preference, it was a cultural imperative. The 13th century English chronicler, John of Wallingford, complained bitterly about the Norsemen in England. He wrote that they bathed every Saturday, combed their hair regularly, and changed their clothes frequently. Why did this bother him so much? Because, he lamented, their impeccable hygiene made them irresistible to English ladies, allowing them to seduce the daughters of noblemen and take them as mistresses. They weren't just conquering with the axe, they were conquering with combs. This fastidious grooming was a strategic advantage. When Vikings settled in places like England or France, they didn't remain outsiders. They integrated, traded, and married into local populations. And arriving clean with a tidy beard and well-kept clothes made a powerful statement. It said, "We are not savages, we are civilized." There's even evidence they dyed their hair. Blondness was highly prized in Norse society. Darker-haired men and women would use a strong soap with a high lye content to bleach their hair and beards to a pale yellow. They were literally dying to look good. Cleanliness also had a spiritual dimension. To appear dishevelled was a sign of disrespect, not just to others, but to oneself and the gods. A warrior was expected to enter the feast hall looking his best. In the sagas, heroes are constantly described washing and changing their clothes before important events. Grooming was so essential that these tools were buried with them, ensuring they would look presentable in the afterlife. So forget the image of the filthy brute. Picture instead a warrior who braids his beard before a battle, who wears a polished silver brooch to fasten his cloak, and who, after the fighting is done, heads to a communal steam bath to relax. The Vikings were refined in their own rugged way. Their appearance was a tool, a form of social power, and a weapon just as effective as any blade. Fact 4. Gliding on the bones of beasts. The Viking obsession with appearance reveals their mastery of social environments, but their true genius lay in mastering the natural world. In the frozen north, where winter was not just a season but a dominant force of nature, the land transformed. Rivers and lakes became solid highways of ice, And when the world froze, the Vikings didn't hibernate, they adapted. They took the leg bones of horses, cattle, and deer, and they learned to fly. They invented bone skates. This wasn't sport, it was a revolutionary form of transportation. The long, flat metatarsal bones were polished smooth. Holes were drilled at each end, and leather straps were used to lash them to the bottom of their boots. Unlike modern skates, these had no sharp edge to cut into the ice. They glided on top of it. To move, the skater would use one or two poles, often tipped with iron, to push themselves forward across the frozen expanse. Imagine the advantage. A hunter could pursue game across a frozen marsh in near silence. A messenger could travel between villages in a fraction of the time it would take to trudge through deep snow. And a war party could stage a surprise attack, gliding across a frozen fjord at dawn, their approach swift and soundless. No hoofprints, no crunching of snow. Just the whisper of bone on ice. Archaeologists have found these skates all over Scandinavia, from bustling trade centres to remote farmsteads. They've been found in the graves of adults and, poignantly, in the graves of children. Some of the smallest skates are barely the length of a hand, suggesting that from a very young age, Viking children were taught not just to walk, but to glide. It was a fundamental skill for life in the north. These were not disposable items. One skate was found carefully repaired with a copper rivet, a testament to its value. They were a necessary tool, a key to unlocking the landscape when it was at its most hostile. The image is a powerful one. It shatters our perception of Vikings as earthbound warriors. Picture a lone figure, cloak billowing, pushing themselves across a vast, glittering sheet of ice, their shadow trailing behind them. They were masters of a frozen world, engineers of the elements. They didn't just survive the winter, they harnessed it. They moved like ghosts across a land of glass, turning the harshest season into their own personal thoroughfare. Fact 5. The servant's final duty. From the ingenuity of life, we turn to the grim theatre of death. In the year 922, an Arab diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan travelled along the Volga River and encountered a group of Norsemen known as the Rus. There he witnessed a Viking funeral for a powerful chieftain, and the account he wrote would leave an indelible stain on the pages of history. The chieftain's longship was brought ashore and placed upon a pyre. His body was dressed in fine clothes and laid within the ship, surrounded by his most prized possessions, his weapons, his food, and even his sacrificed animals. But the Vikings believed a great man should not enter the afterlife alone. He needed his retinue. He needed his servants. And so a slave girl was chosen to accompany him. Ibn Fadlan's account is chillingly specific. He describes how the girl, after volunteering for this honour, was passed from man to man in a series of rituals. She was given intoxicating drinks, likely laced with hallucinogenic herbs, and made to sing, sometimes joyfully, sometimes in a state of terror. She was being prepared, transformed from a person into a sacred offering. The climax of the ritual took place in a tent erected on the ship. There, an old woman known as the Angel of Death presided over the sacrifice. The girl was given a final, potent drink. She was then strangled with a cord by two men, while the Angel of Death stabbed her repeatedly with a dagger. Outside, the other men beat on their shields, the percussive rhythm intended to drown out her screams and transform the act of killing into a sacred rite. Her body was then placed beside her master in the ship. The pyre was lit, and the ship became a blazing inferno, a funeral vessel carrying both the dead chieftain and his freshly murdered servant into the next world. This was not an isolated incident. Archaeological evidence from burial sites like Oseberg in Norway, where two women were buried in a lavish ship, suggests that retainer sacrifice was a real, if rare, practice reserved for the highest echelons of society. It was the ultimate display of power and status. A chieftain's influence did not end with his death. It was believed to extend into the afterlife. And he would arrive not as a lonely spirit, but as a lord, with his servants ready to attend him. It's a practice that forces us to confront the brutal hierarchy of their world. For all their talk of honour and glory, that glory was often built on the backs and the lives of the enslaved. The romantic image of the Viking funeral pyre burns away, revealing a much darker truth. A world where one person's glorious afterlife was purchased with another's horrific end. Fact 6. The silence of the forest. In Viking society, the bonds of family were paramount. Kinship determined your allies, your status, and your security. Yet for the most vulnerable member of that family, a newborn infant, A place was not guaranteed. Life in the north was unforgiving. Famine, disease, and brutal winters were constant threats. Every mouth to feed was a strain on resources. And in this world of stark pragmatism, a new life could be weighed and found wanting. If a baby was born deformed, sickly, or simply at a time when the family could not support another child, the father had the legal right to make a devastating choice. He could refuse to accept the infant. This practice, known as infant exposure, was a cold and quiet form of killing. The rejected child would be taken from the warmth of the longhouse and left outside, in the forest, on a barren hillside, or by the water's edge. They were left to the elements, to hunger, or to wild animals. There was no violence, no ceremony, just the act of walking away. It was a death of absence, a cry that would never be answered. Viking law did not see this as murder. A child was not considered a full person with legal rights until the father had formally acknowledged it, usually by picking it up, giving it a name, and presenting it to the family. Before that moment, its fate was entirely at his discretion. The reasons were often born of desperation rather than cruelty. A family on the brink of starvation might see the exposure of a newborn as a tragic necessity to ensure the survival of their other children. A child born with a severe disability would have little chance of surviving the rigours of Viking life, and their death might have been seen as a grim mercy. But we can only imagine the emotional toll. Imagine a mother having carried and birthed a child, being forced to watch as it's taken out into the cold. Imagine the father, walking away from his own flesh and blood, the silence of the forest his only witness. The sagas sometimes tell stories of these abandoned children being found and raised by others, destined to grow into great heroes. But these are the exceptions, the fairy tales that soften a brutal reality. For most, there was no miraculous rescue. Archaeological evidence supports this grim practice. The conspicuous absence of newborn burials in many Viking-era cemeteries suggests that many infants simply disappeared from the record. This practice reveals the razor's edge on which Viking society lived. They were a people who revered family and lineage, yet they were capable of making the most heart-wrenching choices in the name of survival. It's a chilling reminder that for all their strength and honour, they lived in a world where even the most fundamental bond that between a parent and a child could be broken by the cold logic of necessity. Fact 7. The walking canvases. Let us return to the diplomat Ibn Fadlan. His encounters with the Rus on the Volga River provided us with more than just a horrifying account of a funeral. He also gave us one of the only eyewitness descriptions of what Vikings looked like up close. And what he saw was a people who turned their own bodies into works of art. He wrote, "From the tips of their fingers to their necks, each man is tattooed with dark green trees, figures, and other patterns." They were walking canvases. Their skin was a record of their beliefs, their achievements, and their identity. While no Viking skin has survived the centuries, Ibn Fadlan's description, combined with the symbolic nature of their art, has led to a powerful and compelling theory. Tattoos were an integral part of Viking culture. These weren't random decorations. In a world steeped in magic and mythology, symbols had power. The runes of their alphabet were not just letters. They were magical sigils, each with a specific meaning and force. A warrior might tattoo the rune Tiwaz, for the god of justice and war, on his sword arm for victory. Another might bear Algiz, the rune of protection, over his heart. They may have tattooed mythical beasts onto their bodies, the world serpent Jörmungandr coiling around a torso, or Odin's wolves, Geri and Freki, on their shoulders. These were not just images, they were embodiments of power. To carry the image of a dragon was to carry its strength and ferocity. And it likely wasn't just men. Women in Viking society, particularly the seeresses known as volur, practiced a form of magic called sidr. It's highly probable that their bodies were also marked with symbols related to their craft, enhancing their connection to the spirit world. The process itself would have been a ritual. Using a needle made of bone or thorn, the artist would prick the design into the skin, rubbing in a pigment made from soot or crushed minerals, creating the dark green colour Ibn Fadlan described. It was a painful, permanent act, a rite of passage, a memorial for the dead, or a pledge to the gods. To the Christian cultures they encountered, these tattoos were seen as pagan and demonic. But to the Vikings, they were a source of pride. A man's skin told his story. It declared his lineage, his loyalties, and his place in the cosmos. It was a language that everyone, from a fellow warrior to the gods themselves could read. So when you picture a Viking, don't just see a man in armour, see a living tapestry of myth and magic. His story written not in ink on a page, but in pigment under his skin, a permanent declaration of who he was in a world of fleeting, brutal certainty. Fact 8. When the dead don't stay buried. To the Vikings, death was not a final, peaceful end. It was merely a doorway to another existence, but some doors once closed refuse to stay shut. And sometimes, what comes back through is not a gentle spirit, but a monstrous physical horror. They believed in the Draugr. The Draugr was not a ghost. It was a reanimated corpse, an undead creature that possessed a malevolent intelligence and supernatural strength. It was the physical body of the dead, risen from its grave to haunt the living, guard its buried treasure, and wreak havoc on those who had wronged it in life. Norse sagas are filled with terrifying encounters with these revenants. The Draugr could swell to an enormous size, crush men with its bare hands, and pass through solid rock. It was often described as having blue or black skin, the colour of decay, and emitting a foul stench that could drive animals mad. They would ride on the rooftops of houses at night, their immense weight causing the beams to groan and splinter, a terrifying omen for the family huddled inside. This was not just folklore. The fear of the Draugr was so profound that it directly influenced how the Vikings buried their dead. They took elaborate precautions to ensure the deceased stayed in their graves. Archaeologists have found skeletons pinned down with iron stakes, or with large boulders placed on their chests. Some bodies were decapitated, the head placed between the legs or at the feet, a practice known as apotropaic burial, intended to confuse the corpse so it could not find its way out of the grave. In the most extreme cases, the bodies of those feared to become Draugr were dismembered and burned, their ashes scattered to ensure they could never reassemble themselves. The sagas provide a kind of instruction manual for dealing with them. The hero Grettir, in one famous tale, battles a Draugr named Glam. The fight is a brutal, physical struggle. Grettir only manages to defeat the creature by cutting off its head and placing it by its thigh. This was the prescribed method. To kill a Draugr, you had to decapitate it and ensure the head was separated from the body. The belief in the Draugr speaks to a deep cultural anxiety. It reflects a fear of unresolved issues, of greed, vengeance, and injustice that were so powerful they could anchor a soul to its decaying corpse. A person who died with a powerful grudge, or who jealously guarded their wealth, was a prime candidate to become a Draugr. So when the Vikings dug a grave, they weren't just burying a body. They were performing a ritual of containment. They were locking a door against the darkness and praying to the gods that it would never, ever open again. Fact 9. The sacred blood of the horse. In the Viking world, the horse was more than just an animal. It was a symbol of power, wealth, and freedom. It was a warrior's partner in battle and a farmer's companion in the fields. But the horse also held a sacred, spiritual significance that tied it directly to the gods. And sometimes to honour those gods, this noble creature had to die. Ritual horse sacrifice was a central part of Norse paganism. At great religious festivals, like the one held at Gamla Uppsala in Sweden, horses were among the most prestigious offerings. The ritual was known as a blot, a blood offering to gain the favour of the gods. The animal would be led to a sacred enclosure, its life taken with a ceremonial knife. Its blood was collected in bowls and then sprinkled on the statues of the gods, on the walls of the temple, and on the people themselves. This was not a simple slaughter, it was a profound act of communion, a way of binding the world of mortals to the world of the divine, through the life force of a sacred animal. The meat of the sacrificed horse was then cooked and eaten by the community in a great feast. To consume the flesh of the offering was to internalize its power and to share a meal with the gods themselves. This practice was so deeply ingrained that it became a major point of conflict when Christianity arrived. Missionaries were horrified by it, and refusing to eat horse meat became a key test of a convert's new faith. Horse sacrifice was also a crucial part of funerary rites for the elite. A great chieftain or warrior was not expected to walk into the afterlife. He would ride. His favourite horse would be sacrificed and buried with him, either whole or sometimes just the head and hooves, ready to serve him in the next world. The famous Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials both contained the skeletons of multiple horses, interred to accompany their masters. In Norse mythology, Horses are the companions of the gods. Odin rides his 8-legged steed, Sleipnir, who can gallop between the 9 realms. The sun and moon are pulled across the sky in chariots drawn by divine horses. To sacrifice a horse was to send a message directly to the gods, using a messenger they understood and respected. This practice reveals the unsentimental, yet deeply spiritual nature of their faith. Life was a cycle, and death was a necessary part of that cycle. To give one of their most valuable and beloved animals to the gods was the ultimate expression of devotion, a powerful and bloody prayer for fertility, victory, and a safe passage to the world beyond. Fact 10. The bread of desperation. The Vikings were masters of their environment, but even they could not control the weather. When the harvest failed, when a long and brutal winter killed their livestock, a threat more terrifying than any enemy army crept into the longhouse: starvation. In these desperate times, when the grain stores were empty and the last salted fish was gone, they turned to a food source that speaks volumes about their will to survive. They made bread from bones. This was not a myth. It was a grim reality of famine. Archaeologists have found ancient grinding stones, or querns, with fragments of animal bone embedded in their surfaces. The Vikings would take the leftover bones from previous meals, dry them by the fire until they were brittle, and then smash and grind them into a coarse, gritty powder. This bone meal was not nutritious. It offered little more than calcium and trace minerals. But it was filler. It could be mixed with whatever else they could find: tree bark, lichen, dried moss, or if they were lucky, a handful of actual grain flour. This grim dough was then shaped into hard, flat cakes and baked on hot stones. The result was known as bone bread. The taste was likely bitter and bland, the texture hard and sandy. Eating it was a chore that would have worn down their teeth. Indeed, some Viking skeletons show extreme dental wear, their molars ground almost flat, a testament to a diet that included grit, sand and bone. Bone bread was not food. It was survival made edible. It was a way to fill a gnawing stomach and trick the body into feeling full, to hold on for just one more day, one more week, hoping for the thaw, for the return of the fishing boats, for an end to the hunger. It represents the absolute limit of their resourcefulness. They were a people who wasted nothing. The very bones of the animals that had sustained them in times of plenty were called upon to sustain them again in times of want. But there is a darker shadow to this story. In the most severe famines, when all the animal bones were gone, is it possible they turned to other sources? The sagas are silent on the matter, but they speak of cursed winters and of families who disappeared behind the closed doors of their longhouses. While there is no definitive proof of survival cannibalism, the existence of bone bread opens a window into a world of unimaginable hardship, a world where the line between resource and taboo could become terrifyingly thin. It is a stark reminder that the strength of the Vikings was not just measured in battle, but in their ability to endure the unendurable. Fact 11. The law of the slap. Viking women are often portrayed as uniquely empowered for their time, and in many ways, they were. They could inherit property, run businesses, initiate divorce, and command respect in their communities. A woman was the master of the household, symbolised by the key she wore at her belt. But this power had its limits, and within the confines of marriage, there was a dark and unsettling reality. Under Viking law, a man could legally strike his wife. The law codes, like the Icelandic Draugrs, are explicit. Violence against a wife was not encouraged, but it was regulated. A man was permitted to hit his wife, but there were rules. For example, he could not leave a blue mark or a bloody wound. If he did, the wife had grounds for divorce and could claim compensation. Some laws even stipulated that a man could give his wife a slap, but not beat her with his fist. It was a legal system that attempted to draw a line between what it considered acceptable discipline and what constituted unacceptable abuse. The trigger for this permissible violence was often a matter of honour. If a wife publicly insulted her husband, shamed his family, or was unfaithful, he had the right to respond with physical force to correct her behaviour and restore his own honour. This creates a deeply uncomfortable paradox. A woman could be a powerful landowner, but in her own home, she could be subject to legally sanctioned violence. It reveals that while women had significant economic and social rights, the patriarchal structure was still firmly in place. A man's honour was paramount, and the law protected his right to defend it, even against his own wife. However, a woman was not without recourse. If a man crossed the line, if the violence was too severe or too frequent, she could fight back through the legal system. The process of divorce was remarkably straightforward. A woman simply had to declare herself divorced in front of witnesses, at her home at the local assembly, and she was free. She would take her dowry and any personal property with her. This complex reality shows that the Viking world was not a simple one of either female empowerment or oppression. It was a society in constant negotiation, where the rights of women were real but conditional, and where the line between love and law, honour and violence could be a very dangerous one to cross. Fact 12. The Bells of Terror. The Vikings were masters of psychological warfare. Their dragon-headed ships were designed to inspire terror before they even reached the shore. But they had other, more subtle ways of breaking an enemy's spirit. One of the most chilling was their use of sound. Imagine you are a monk in a quiet coastal village in England. It is the hour before dawn. The only sounds are the gentle lapping of the waves and the cry of gulls. Then you hear it. A faint, metallic jingling, carried on the wind. It grows louder, more insistent. It is not the sound of church bells. It is the sound of dread. It is the sound of the Vikings. Some raiding parties, particularly those on horseback, would attach small bells to their gear, to their saddles, their belts, even the hilts of their swords. This was not for decoration. It was a calculated tactic of terror. By the time you heard the bells, it was already too late to mount a defence. The sound announced their inevitable arrival, giving you just enough time to panic. It turned the final minutes before an attack into an agony of anticipation. Fear did half the work before a single axe was swung. People would flee their homes, abandoning everything, their courage shattered by a simple, rhythmic sound. This tactic deliberately twisted a symbol of peace and order into a herald of chaos and death. In a Christian land, the sound of a bell called people to prayer, to community, to safety. The Vikings co-opted that sound and turned it into a promise of violence. Irish and Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention raiders being heard by bell and horn, a terrifying symphony of noise designed to disorient and terrify. It was organised chaos, a weapon that attacked the mind before the body. This strategy reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The Vikings knew that fear was a more powerful weapon than any piece of steel. They didn't always rely on stealth. Sometimes they chose to announce their presence, to let the sound of their coming march ahead of them, and to conquer a village with nothing more than a handful of metal bells and the terror they inspired. Fact 13. The Trophies of Bone. A victorious warrior brings home trophies: a fine sword, a piece of armour, a bag of silver. But for some Vikings, the ultimate trophy was far more personal and infinitely more macabre. They brought home the skulls of their enemies. This wasn't just about collecting gruesome souvenirs, it was a profound statement of dominance. To possess an enemy's skull was to possess their identity, their strength, and their memory. The sagas and other accounts describe this practice. In the Ynglinga saga, a king orders the skull of a fallen foe to be mounted in silver and used as a ceremonial drinking cup. This image of Vikings drinking from the skulls of their enemies became a powerful and enduring part of their fearsome reputation. While archaeological evidence for skull cups is scarce, the ritualistic importance of the human head is not. At cult sites in Denmark, human skulls have been found deliberately placed in sacrificial pits, alongside weapons and animal bones. These were not battle remains, they were offerings to the gods. The symbolism is rooted in their cosmology. In the Norse creation myth, the sky itself is formed from the skull of the primordial giant, Ymir. The skull was a sacred object, a microcosm of the universe. To keep a skull, therefore, could be a deeply symbolic act. It was a way of saying, I have utterly defeated you, I have taken everything, even the vessel of your thoughts, and I have made it my own. Some warriors may have worn fragments of skull as amulets, believing they could absorb the courage of the person they had slain. This practice would have been terrifying to their opponents. It went beyond simple killing. It was a desecration, a denial of a proper burial, and an eternal insult. It was another tool in their arsenal of psychological warfare. Whether every Viking collected skulls is doubtful, but the fact that some did, and that the stories of it were told and retold, was enough. It cemented their image as warriors who did not just conquer you on the battlefield, but who would continue to dominate you, even in death. Fact 14. The taboo of male magic. In the Viking world, magic was not a thing of fantasy. It was a real and potent force known as Seder. It could be used to tell the future, to cast curses, to heal the sick, or to summon storms. But this power came with a strict and unwritten rule. Seder was women's work. The practitioners of this magic were the Verlur, female seeresses who were both revered and feared. They travelled the land, performing rituals, falling into trances, and speaking the will of the gods. Their power was immense, but if a man practiced Seder, he was not seen as powerful. He was seen as shameful. The Old Norse word for this was ergi, a term that implied effeminacy, weakness, and perversion. It was one of the gravest insults you could level at a Viking man, an accusation that could lead to ostracism or even violence. Masculinity in the Viking Age was defined by direct action, by honour won in battle, by strength and straightforwardness. Seder, on the other hand, was seen as manipulative, subtle, and deceptive, qualities associated with the feminine. For a man to engage in it was to transgress a fundamental social and gender boundary. And yet here is the great contradiction. The most powerful and revered god in their pantheon, Odin, the All-Father, was the ultimate master of Seder. The sagas say he learned the art from the goddess Freyja, and he used it to gain knowledge and control fate. But even Odin was not immune to the stigma. The trickster god Loki, in one famous poem, openly mocks Odin for practicing this unmanly art. This tells us that the Vikings lived with a fascinating tension. Their chief god was a sorcerer, yet mortal men who followed his path were shamed for it. It suggests that this kind of power was considered too dangerous, too ambiguous for ordinary men to handle. Of course, some men did practice magic, but they did so in secret. They were the hidden sorcerers, the ones who risked their reputation for a taste of forbidden knowledge. Their existence was a testament to the irresistible allure of power, even when that power came with the price of shame. It was a world where magic was real, but where the right to wield it was a matter of gender, and for a man to cross that line was to risk everything. Fact 15. The keys to a lost future. Our final fact is not one of violence or strange ritual, but of a quiet, profound sadness. In Viking society, the symbol of a woman's authority was the key. Worn at her belt, it signified her role as the mistress of the longhouse, the keeper of the food stores, the manager of the family's wealth. It was a badge of honour and responsibility. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have excavated the graves of women, and they are often buried with their keys, a sign of their status. But sometimes they find these keys in the graves of girls as young as 10 or 12, girls who never lived to become the mistresses of a household. Why would a child be buried with a symbol of adult power? The answer is heartbreaking. It was likely an act of symbolic grief, a way for a family to honour the life their daughter never got to live. They buried her not as the child she was, but as the woman she should have become. The key was a promise, a hope for the afterlife. It ensured that in the next world she could take her rightful place, with the status and dignity that a cruel fate had denied her on earth. It is a gesture of immense tenderness from a people we often remember only for their hardness. It speaks to their deep love for their children and their belief in a future beyond the grave. In a world where life was so often short and brutal, they paused to mourn not just a death, but the loss of a future. This small, rusted key, found in the hand of a child, tells us more about the Viking heart than any battle axe. It reminds us that beneath the armour and the legends, they were parents who grieved, families who loved, and a people who, in the face of unbearable loss, could still perform an act of profound and sorrowful hope. So there you have it. Fire from filth, wings of bone, combs as weapons, keys to eternity. The Vikings were not simple. They were a people of jarring contradictions. They were pragmatic scientists and devout spiritualists. They were obsessively clean and horrifically violent. They empowered their women with rights and yet constrained them with laws of honour. They were a people who could glide silently over a frozen lake on bones and announce their arrival with a cacophony of terror. The 15 facts we have explored peel back the layers of myth to reveal a culture that was complex, resourceful, and often deeply unsettling. They force us to look beyond the caricature of the barbarian and see the human beings who lived and died in a harsh and demanding world. Their solutions were often brutal, their beliefs strange, but their will to survive, to create order, and to leave a mark on the world was undeniable. The true story of the Vikings is not written in glory alone. It is also written in the quiet desperation of bone bread, in the silent sorrow of a child's grave, and in the terrifying logic of the blood eagle. To understand them, we must be willing to look into these shadows. If this journey into the dark heart of the Viking Age has fascinated you, consider liking this video and subscribing for more explorations into the unfiltered truths of history. What other secrets of the past should we uncover? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us. Stay curious, and never be afraid to question the stories you think you know.